Hello and welcome to the Comic Cave. I'm Ramsey, aka Captain Away, and today I'm looking at the 2004 to 2005 and 2005 to 2006 series Black Widow, also referred to as Black Widow Homecoming and Black Widow: The Things They Say About Her. Natalia Romanova, or Natasha, originally appeared in an issue of Tales of Suspense as the nefarious Black Widow, an evil Soviet femme fatale super spy villain up against the invincible Iron Man. Spoiler alert, she lost. Over the years, we learn a little about her backstory, including that she was once a ballerina and she had been trained as a super spy by the Soviet Black Widow program run out of something called the Red Room. Her appearance would change drastically in an issue of Spider-Man into a look that would stick much better for the character, but by that time she had defected from the Soviets and joined up with the Avengers in their fight against evil. Over the years, Widow would work with S.H.I.E.L.D., team up with Daredevil, and would even lead the short-lived superhero team, the Champions. At one point, she would also gain an imitator in Yelena Belova, the blonde-haired Black Widow who had also graduated from Black Widow training camp and saw herself as Natasha's replacement. Following the breakup of the Avengers, as chronicled in Disassembled, Natasha retired from both the superhero and the spy life and moved out west to Arizona, and it was at this point that acclaimed sci-fi writer Richard K. Morgan was asked to write a series about the character. My understanding is that a Marvel editor, that I'm going to guess was Jennifer Lee, seeing as she's the editor on this, read Morgan's novel Altered Carbon. You may be familiar with the Netflix show of the same name based on the novel, and was impressed with how he handled female characters in the book, and so asked him to come write a comic about a female Marvel character. That comic ended up being Black Widow, and that led almost immediately into a follow-up series that served to tie up some loose ends from the first story. So let's see what new dangers Morgan brings to the table for Widow and take this away. The comic opens on a bunch of women being murdered. We got one in London being exploded by a car bomb, one in Alabama being shot at a pro-choice protest, another is in Osaka killed by several men who used spider venom to hide the murder, another in Sydney who's dead from, something I'm sure, and lastly one in Shanghai who I guess is also dead. Maybe she was burned? I don't know. Man, this art is freaking terrible. I've seen this described as a noir style, but I think that is a terrible descriptor. Noir visually was often crystal clear, using drastic contrast between light and shadow to create impactful images. This just looks like a bunch of scratchy lines that are there supposedly as shading, but really to try and excuse and hide how janky and messy the art is on its own. Which makes it somewhat ironic that as we turn the page and check in on our title character, we find ourselves out in the bright Arizona desert, where it's almost impossible to use that kind of shading to hide the horrible proportions the artist gives for everything. Seriously, how long are this guy's freaking fingers? What is he, Slender Man? That's some nightmare fuel right there, is what that is. This supposed distressed motorist turns out to be an assassin, and he attempts to kill Black Widow, but he should have checked the title of this comic, because no way the title character is going down that easy. Instead, she slaps him and then does some kind of scratchy, blocky, shadowy thing and lets him bleed out on the ground while waiting for him to respond to who sent him. Realizing someone wants her dead, Natalia drives off, reconnecting with an old S.H.I.E.L.D. connection named Phil Dexter. They present Phil as a character you'd already know, but don't worry if you feel like your Marvel cred is at risk. He's a new character. The past they establish is that Fury fired him from S.H.I.E.L.D. for drinking on the job and disobeying orders, though he's real touchy on the subject, suggesting he quit for stand-up reasons. I mean, everyone says that when they're fired from clandestine spy agencies, bro. Phil is some kind of private detective now, so Nat recruits him to look into a finger she removed from her attacker. Oh, I mean the ring on the finger. Ew, she was just carrying that thing around with her? You're weird, BW. Phil says he has contacts that can look into it, but in the meantime he introduces her to a different mystery. The death of that pro-choicer in Alabama, who turns out was a deep cover agent originally from Russia named Stefania Melnikova, not Stacy Matheson like she claimed. So the two head across the country to check it out. On the way, they run across a hitchhiker fleeing from some truckers demanding payment for the lift. Payment of the kind that young girl Sally Ann here doesn't want to pay. Though you probably can't tell from the way she's drawn, Sally Ann is supposed to be around 15 years old, apparently. Though they only ever seem to actually say her age one time, and that's not until the sequel. She's running away from a drunk abusive father and a battered mom, and Black Widow can't help but intervene in this attack on the girl, killing one of the truckers and crippling the other, having promised them both earlier that they wouldn't walk again if they didn't back off. Man, Black Widow is brutal. They get to Alabama without further incident and begin digging into the past of that murdered Russian spy turned protester Stacy, finding a letter to confirm her role as an ex-Soviet spy and also finding that she was on some pretty intense drugs, including something called Medusagen and some military-grade painkillers, which explains the military presence that they saw at her funeral earlier. They trick this Sergeant Forrester guy over to the house and question him about the drugs, but he doesn't get much further than explaining that he wasn't aware of the Medusagen and that Stacy was pregnant before they get attacked and he dies. When Phil and Nat get away from their mysterious attackers, they return to investigating the first assassin in his ring, because it turns out that opening assassin was working for the Red Room, the same people that turned Natasha into the Black Widow. So Nat goes to talk with an old handler from the Red Room, and by talk I mean inject him with some kind of truth serum. This leads her to another guy, NSA agent and all-around bad dude, Martin Ferris, who she lures to his bedroom with promises of some pretty kinky sex, before instead injecting him with some kind of nightmare cocktail of hallucinogens in order to get him to spill his guts. And spill he does, though apparently he doesn't really know much. What we learn is that the Red Room is now active again, going by 2R now, and they're busy selling secrets to an American company named Gynecon, though what the link is isn't entirely clear. To find out, Nat heads to Russia, where she spends most of her time feeling nostalgic about the old days, like when she was training to be a ballerina. Only a lot has changed, including the fact that no one seems to know her old ballet teacher. Curious. She eventually takes a clue from a hammer and sickle sign, and though I'm not clear what she's exactly realizing, I do like how this important sign has been hanging over the scene for several pages now, like it's been monitoring her as she attempts to move about incognito. Not some pretty noir shit, and while I may hate the art in general, sometimes they really do things right in this series. Inside the building, Natasha's reality comes crashing down, first as she relives her ballet training from a different perspective, seeing it now for the first time as some kind of psychological conditioning she was forced to watch, not something she was actively participating in. This gets spelled out for us more plainly as she comes across an old man who has continued to live in the building, and he informs her that the ballet thing was, in fact, an implant. Much of the training BW received was psychological, including an overwhelming sense of nausea she gets whenever she tries to think about the past or the conditioning she received. Perhaps the biggest revelation here, though, is that she's not the only Black Widow, and that's not a reference to Yelena Belova, as it's declared here that she was not actually part of the Black Widow program, but instead another program modeled on it. Not sure it was necessary to diss Yelena like that, but I guess it's the only way their narrative makes sense. I guess. This will be expanded on as Natasha traces down another lead to this old woman named Ludmila Kudrin. Oh, excuse me, Ludmila Antonovna Kudrin. So sorry. Kudrin was one of the heads of the Black Widow program, who helped develop them all into killers, psychologically conditioned them, and developed the biochemical makeup that made them essentially super soldiers, including the fact that they never age. She also helped develop some kind of control sand, as the men in Moscow who ran things weren't comfortable with the idea of women becoming too powerful, because of course, men, am I right, ladies? So the girls in the Black Widow program were conditioned to be unable to resist or rebel when confronted with a certain smell. Kudrin also explains that Nick Fury found out about this scent during his own spy days, and in fact even used it to help convince Natasha defect to the US. Considering that the original story had Natasha falling in love with Hawkeye and that being what convinced her to defect, I'm heavily disturbed by the extremely rapey implications of this throwaway statement. This is finally where we learn why Gynecon. It seems Gynecon, a beauty company who makes products like the Dasan Red perfume that we saw being used earlier in the series and even had an entire cover of the series dedicated to its "now that's what I call a woman" slogan, wants all these chemicals that helped keep the Black Widows young and youthful to sell them in their beauty products. That's it. That's the whole plot. Okay, let me explain it real quick in case you're missing things. Following the collapse of the Iron Curtain in the Soviet Union, Russia became a capitalist society. This led to old Soviet programs like the Red Room rebranding and revitalizing for money, leading them to becoming 2R and selling their old formulas to American companies for profit. Companies run by people like this guy, Ian McMasters, the CEO of Gynecon, who realized that his patents for those formulas would be invalidated by the blood work of former Black Widows and the fact that these chemicals already existed inside their systems. So he had 2R systematically eliminate all the Black Widows. Only the one sent to kill Natasha failed, and his mutilated body even ended up on the news. So Gyna CEO here instead hired private security firm North to finish the job. So North agents Hunter and Kestrel have spent the entire series hunting Nat and Phil, always a step behind, until they finally manage to track down Phil while Natasha is still in Russia, and break into his safe house Schmape house with guns blazing, nearly killing both him and poor Sally Ann. So all this death and destruction is for no reason other than pure greedy capitalism. Oh, excuse me, market forces. Because the word capitalism is verbum non grata in this series, and at every point they could say it, characters are instead required to say market forces, which, incidentally, was also the name of Richard K. Morgan's most recent book at the time. Funny how that works. Thanks to Fury, Nat is able to get her revenge on North Agent Hunter, the one who actually did the shooting, by shooting out his kneecaps and then throwing a grenade into his car, which seems to me like a really stupid thing to do. How hard would it have been for him to grab that grenade and toss it out the car, maybe even at her? Very fortunate that he doesn't, though, I guess. From there, she shows up to take out Gynecon CEO McMasters, but he's protected by this Red Room assassin, Vasily Ilyich Ulyanov, who had the foresight to wear the Black Widow control scent, preventing Natasha from fighting back. At least until she kinda goats him into breaking her nose, and suddenly she can't smell anything anymore. With that obstacle out of her way, she makes short work of both Vasily and CEO McMasters, though she doesn't manage to learn where Sally Ann is before the page count runs out and we're left with a stay tuned for Series 2. For that series, Natasha is attempting to seek asylum in Cuba, in Havana, Unana, going so far as to hide with Yelena Belova, who is living down there as a successful lingerie model, as we learned in the last series, though she does apparently have some political connections, because we can rest assured that she hasn't fully left the game. Nat is on the run because, as it turns out, when you murder the CEO of a company and his bodyguard in cold blood, especially when that CEO turns out to be golfing buddies with the head of presidentially approved private armies like North, people come after you to stop you. Crazy thought, I know. In fact, the then current president, who I think is given a different name, but this was 2005 and Nick Fury does say he wasn't actually elected, so, you know, wink, declares Natasha as being public enemy number 1. Yelena promises to help Nat with her problems in exchange for some covert ops help for her problems, so Nat ends up back in America and shaking down some medical suppliers for some drugs Yelena has been trying to get into Cuba for humanitarian reasons. So that's good drugs, not bad drugs. I mean, you know what I mean. But while shaking down the suits that run the warehouse, Widow finds a case of Medusa-gen? For whatever reason, this catches her attention enough that she decides to track down where it's headed, and that leads her to a doctor who apparently operated, maybe, on Sally Ann. The bad doc apparently doesn't know where the Medusa-gen or Sally went. He doesn't really know anything beyond that he works for some local gangsters. So Black Widow goes all Black Ops on the gang activities to try and draw them out so she can figure out where they're keeping Sally Ann. This leads her to a particular mob boss, boss, but when she tries to abduct him, she's found by the forces that are hunting her. Those forces include Kestrel, who's extra pissed about Nat killing her partner, and that Martin Ferris guy, who is extra pissed about Nat wounding his fragile male ego. Fury interrupts their attempts to kill Nat though, and Daredevil also shows up to try and help out, since Natasha left him a message earlier about what she was doing. But despite her phone message confession, she very angrily decrees that she doesn't want his help and he doesn't want to get involved. Yeah, I'm sure that'll work. For his interference in Natasha's capture, Fury gets jailed as a terrorist under the Patriot Act, meaning he doesn't have rights to a lawyer despite Matt Murdock showing up to try and be one. Murdock gets angry about this and lashes out, beating up all the North agents in the room, but this only gets him in trouble as well, and he's forced to go on the run. The mob boss Widow captured, this guy with the super gangsta name of Bobby, leads Nat back to Cuba into a secret encampment where Sally Ann is being held. This base is owned by the Cutting Corporation, a company that acquired Gynecon after the death of McMasters, as we learned earlier from a fragment of a random news broadcast. Cutting Co. has apparently been abducting girls and making them disappear down to Cuba, where they can experiment on them in definitely extremely illegal ways as they attempt to create a workforce that is entirely compliant, so we can do away with those annoying things that stand in the way of profits like strikes, healthcare, sick days, vacation, etc. Sally Ann was just meant to be held there indefinitely, but the men working there also have a sick fascination with torturing the girls. And when they tortured one girl too many, one step too far, they seek out Sally as a replacement experiment subject. Widow attempts to break into the facility to break Sally Ann free, but while she succeeds at getting her out the gate, Nat is forced to throw herself as a distraction at all the guards in order to give Sally Ann time to get away. This works more or less, with Sally disappearing into the woods, forcing search parties to be sent after her, but it does get Widow captured. Natasha is okay with that, though, if it means Sally Ann gets away, because she stood up to torture before. She's even been trained and conditioned to deal with torture thanks to the Black Widow program, so she's not too worried about what the angry Kestrel and Ferris plan to do to her. And what they do is spend a good chunk of an issue on a crazy acid trip that Ferris is attempting to have mirror the one she gave him in the first series. But Nat comes out of it all like, "That's all you got? Pathetic." But that's not all they got, turns out. They also got Sally Ann. Well, shit. Black Widow is devastated at having failed Sally Ann, but she tells her that it's okay and she was happy to have met Nat and that she was like a mother to Sally Ann. I mean, like a real mother, and not Sally's actual mother, who, again, just let her daughter get abused by her father and did nothing to stop it. And then Yelena shows up with a hit squad and rescues them all. Well, that was convenient. But I guess, once again, we were running out of page count. Although, to be fair, it's not like there wasn't also a fair amount of setup to hint this was going to happen, like when Yelena seemingly randomly meets Matt Murdock outside the gates of the same facility. Yelena uses her contacts to help rescue the girls in the facility and possibly bring down the Cutting Corporation. But like with Gynecon, they'll probably just be replaced with someone just as bad, if not worse. We then get a speech from the president about the dangers of mass superheroes and all they represent, as well as a warning that a storm is coming, a clear setup for the upcoming Civil War event. Which brings this comic to an end, and us to the breakdown. Man, there's a lot to unpack here that I can't begin to get into during just a simple breakdown segment, but let me touch on some of it. I know Morgan was hired to portray strong women, but he might go a little far with trying to live up to that. It is so much woman stuff, woman stuff, woman stuff. Which wouldn't even be that much of a thing if it didn't feel like all the artists were trying to completely contradict that by trying to sexualize Natasha and other female characters every chance they got. Also, I know Nat's an ex-spy, but she's also supposed to be a superhero by now, but man does she get brutal and killy in this series. She has little to no remorse about going on crazy murder sprees like a trigger-happy serial killer. Like, damn. But honestly, those are all things I like about the series too. The series really highlights the difference between portrayals of male and female comic book characters, while Nat is written largely the way a male would be in these situations. Don't tell me characters like the Punisher wouldn't have done a lot of the same things here, particularly in terms of the murdering. And man, can it be satisfying sometimes when Nat gets those men who have been after her. And it does all that without ever denying that the character is a woman. Whether it's reminding us through speeches about what being a woman is like, or through Black Widow randomly wandering around in front of Phil in her underwear for no reason whatsoever, or through literally naming a corporation Gynacon. Also, I love that the boundaries between who the heroes and who the villains are become so poorly defined. Because in a lot of stories, a character doing what Natasha is doing would be treated unquestionably as the villain. Instead, this story highlights the dangers and shortfallings of American capitalism, all while reflecting similarities between that and the dangers of communism, which really, for a comic about an ex-Soviet, that is probably exactly what a Black Widow series should be doing. It does such a good job of reflecting the paranoia and political turmoil of the Bush years that I can't think of a single comic that better sets up the mood for going into Marvel's Civil War event, which would happen immediately after this. So it's such a shame that Civil War completely ruined all that by intentionally betraying character continuity to set characters on the opposite side of the conflict than would make sense for them, but that's a complaint for another video. So really, my only complaint is how ugly the art is, and it only gets worse in the second series. And it's honestly kind of a shame that this otherwise fascinating series got saddled with such mediocre art. But even I'll admit that this supposed noir style does fit the mood of the comic pretty well. So I'm giving this series a recommendation level of medium. If you can get past the art style, there's a pretty exciting and interesting spy thriller here that probably could be better, but I've definitely seen much worse. The collected editions get 3 bottles of Medusa gin. That's a bad thing in case you weren't sure, which is going to break down just like this. Both collections have 6 issues and have basically no bonus features whatsoever. The third volume listed here is a collection of both series together, but it doesn't have any more extras, so I'm not really rating it any higher. Thanks everybody for watching. I was hoping to have this out in time for the Black Widow movie, but, you know, things happen. Like Ramsey forgetting that the movie was coming out. Things like that. Anyway, if you see the movie, let me know what you think, but please, no spoilers, as it'll probably be a while before I see it. I've got more summer fun headed your way next time, so make sure to click the like and subscribe and the notification button and do all the things so you can be sure to stick around, and I hope to see you then, right here, in the Comic Cave.